Okay, so yeah, I'm going to talk about GP recruitment from the kind of practice management perspective. So as John said, I'm James, so I am the practice manager at Amicus Health. I've actually been working in primary care management for the last 15 years, and I've been the practice manager at Amicus for the last 5. In that time, I have done quite a lot of recruitment. So in the last 5 years, I've actually recruited 16 GPs. And at least 100 other members of clinical and non-clinical staff. And our current staff levels, thanks to the vaccine centre, which had to recruit about 30 people in 2 weeks, currently is about 125 people. So in that time, I've undertaken about 250 interviews, which has been fun. I love interviews. They're one of my favourite things to do. So hopefully I can impart some wisdom from what I've learned. So what I'm going to kind of cover a bit is some pre-application things. So I think obviously you've gone through kind of CVs and cover letters and things, but some other things to think about before you're applying, before you go to an interview. How recruitment kind of works in general practice. What are the things that we're kind of doing on the other side as part of any recruitment process? What you need to do before you come in for an interview, what will make you stand out when you're in your interview, and then kind of how to succeed through it. So some tips kind of pre-interview. I think one of the things is being clear about what you're looking for in a role and making sure that you're actually the right fit for the role that you're applying for. I think probably there is different practices are needing different things. Understanding what you want out of a role and then finding a role that's going to fit and make sure that you are the right person and it's the right practice for you is quite important. I think particularly where there are kind of lots of jobs going and lots of variability as to what those kind of jobs look like in a way that I don't think existed sort of 5 or 10 years ago, understanding the role that you're going for and making sure that it is actually what you want. So do your research. Just because there's an advert out there, make sure it is the right sort of practice for you. Like John said earlier, look at websites, understand what the role is actually going to be involving. So that you do know that you're kind of making that right call, and then make contact. It is really important. I think if you can make contact in some way, it puts you into the kind of practice's head. And as the practice manager, getting kind of CVs and cover letters and things is really important. But actually, if you've made contact with me and I've put a name to a face, or we've had a phone call, even if actually you find that role isn't right for you then, but 3 years later you come back and decide that it might be now, your name's in my head, your face is in my head. And actually then you've kind of jumped up the pile a little bit. And I've had people that, one person once phoned me from Australia, and we had a very long conversation with the conclusion that actually she wasn't coming back to the UK for 2 years. But when she did come back in 2 years, she made such an impression on me that she's now one of our salaried GPs. So making contact is really, really important. And if you can come for a visit, it'll also help you understand whether it is the kind of right fit for you. Is it the ethos and the practice that you actually want to be in? In that line, first impressions really do count, and they will last. It takes a lot of effort to undo a bad first impression. And as John said, it's not just about the impact that you have on the practice manager. It's not just about the impact you have on the GPs. It's the whole team. And I think, you've probably all experienced that kind of practice teams, they are a tight-knit setup. That sense of kind of ownership and loyalty is shared by everybody. And for a lot of staff, it's not just a job, it is more than that. The interviews that I have done for the vast majority of kind of non-clinical staff, when you ask why do you want to work for us, it's because they want to do something that's important, that they care, that they're going to help people. So they all have a kind of stake in the business, and they have a stake in who's going to be joining part of the team. So it is really important, if you are making contact, be nice to the person on the phone, because they will feed back to me if you've been curt with them. Be nice to the person when you come to the reception desk. Try and make a conversation with them, because actually if you made a good impression on them, they're going to feed back to me that actually you're a good person and they would like to see you as part of the team. Even down to the cleaner, just be friendly to everybody, because it is a kind of that family environment which makes general practice so great, but it does mean that everybody can have their views quite kind of subtly put into this process. So make sure that that impression you're making is a good one, and that will help you in the process to go forward. So this then leads into, once you've decided that actually you've come and had a look around, the job is right, you've done all the stuff with your CV, make sure you are applying for the job, not just a job. So in terms of the CV and the cover letter, it's great to kind of have a template set up, but make sure that you do make any changes that might need to happen for the job that you're actually applying for. I can't tell you how many times I have looked at stuff, not so much with GPs, but in general, of clearly just copied and pasted information. Nothing is relevant to the job that is actually being applied for, and I'm pretty quickly going to dismiss that. So tailor your application for the role that you actually are applying for, because otherwise it is really, really obvious that actually you're just sending out lots of applications to lots of places, and you're instantly going to be knocked down the kind of queue. If there is a recruitment process that's being followed, follow that process. So if I ask you for a CV and a cover letter, as John said earlier, don't just send an email with a CV attached to it, because you haven't followed the process that's been set out, which doesn't bode very well for later on in life of kind of how we're going to work together. So if there is a recruitment process and it is a CV and cover letter, do that. If it's applied through an NHS jobs form, as awful as that is, that's the process to follow. So just whatever the recruitment process is, that is what you want to do. I had we did a recruitment recently, and we asked for them to fill in an application form, and they sent me a quite aggressive email about how they didn't feel it was appropriate for them to have to fill in this form because they'd already written a CV, so why should they? Well, needless to say, they didn't move up the kind of recruitment process any further. So, if there is a process, follow it, because there's probably a good reason that it's in place. Which does kind of fit into then the processes that we're going through in the background. So in terms of when we are recruiting, there are more things to consider than just kind of what is the job that we've advertised. There are more costs involved in recruitment than it is immediately obvious from the surface. So obviously, in terms of kind of the financial implications of employing someone, there's usually a reason why we're employing. Either someone's left and we've got to replace them, or we have a new need and we need to bring someone in. So there is the obvious cost of whatever a salary is, but it's important to know that your salary is not the total cost of what it is to the practice. So for every pound that is paid in salary, that is actually a cost of about £1.35 to £1.40 to the practice once you've done pensions and all the other contributions that are involved. It's really quite expensive to employ people. It's very expensive to keep people if they're not the right person. And obviously it takes, the employing GPs is the biggest expense that any GP practice has. So from a financial point of view, going through a recruitment process, there is a massive outlay that we know is coming. But there is also the cost of actually all the processes that go through any kind of recruitment in terms of advertising, the time taken to actually generate an advert, the time to go through the recruitment process. And time has definitely become almost the more important kind of currency in general practice, I think. So a recruitment process, I'd say, as a practice manager, will probably take me a minimum of kind of 2 days, full days worth of work for any one recruitment. By the time I've actually done all the applications, got people in, done all the interviews, gone through all the processes associated with the actual recruitment, alongside the time that whoever's going to be involved in the process in terms of GPs and what that will mean for appointments being missed and things. So the time commitment from going through a recruitment process is pretty extensive, and one that we've got to kind of also set up as part of any kind of recruitment drive that we're going to be doing. Alongside that, there is a pretty significant emotional toil from any kind of recruitment process. Recruitment, you go into any recruitment knowing you're going to disappoint people, which is not a particularly pleasant experience an awful lot of the time. So it is something that is quite draining for people. Doing interviews is an incredibly draining experience. You're going to, not just from the person kind of being interviewed, but also the people doing the interviewing. So as a kind of practice manager, I'm knowing that actually it's going to take a toll in terms of time, and actually from a kind of resilience point of view, it is quite an extensive and kind of draining process to go through in terms of recruitment. You know then that you are going to have to, when you're picking people, you're going to have to then have a process with them afterwards in terms of training and bringing them into the system. And all the while, we're constantly thinking, is this person going to fit into our practice? Are they going to help the team dynamic? So, it is a tight-knit team. When we bring in somebody in, you want to make sure that actually you're going to help that team cohesiveness and drive things forward. So it's something that's kind of running in the back of everybody's mind as we're going through this process. There's obviously also all sorts of fun legal requirements around recruitment. So this is where some of the processes we might go through may seem a little daft sometimes, but ultimately we have to tick a whole load of boxes, both from kind of legal HR point of view, CQC point of view. There's quite a lot of things when we're having to go through a recruitment process that we've got to do just to make sure that we do it all right. And so I think when you've got an interview or you've got your application, it really is a kind of snapshot of what's kind of happening. So it's really just to kind of say, if we are going through a recruitment process and you're in it, and maybe there's a delay in being responded to or things, there's an awful lot going on, and just kind of we'll always be doing our best, but just be aware of what else is involved in the kind of recruitment process. It's more than just reading a CV, doing an interview. So in terms of the kind of process that we then go through, so obviously in terms of kind of getting an application through, getting a job in post, there is the planning process of kind of deciding what we're actually going to recruit. And that does involve then generating job descriptions and adverts and things like that. We have generally thought about what we actually want. And this then ties back into the making sure the job is right for you. If we're asking for 6 sessions and it's spread over Monday, Thursday, Friday, there's probably a fairly good reason why we've asked for that. So actually, if you're definitely not looking for those sessions or those days, there may be some flexibility sometimes, but equally there is probably that's where our gap is. So if you are applying, that is what you're applying for. It can't always be completely kind of flexible. We'll then go through the recruitment process. A recruitment process generally takes about 6 weeks, I would say, in total, from kind of getting everything set up, running adverts, shortlisting, doing interviews, and then getting all of the recruitment checks in and done and everything. So there is a significant period of time to actually kind of run through that process. And then once you've got somebody, you've obviously got to induct them, support them, get everything set up, payroll, pensions, and everything going forward. And unlike somewhere like the RD&E or CCG or something like that, that is generally going to be me doing that. So there is no massive HR department sitting behind me. I have a lovely ops manager who I make do a lot of the grunt work that I don't want to do anymore. But there isn't a massive kind of HR department. There isn't those teams that are going to be able to carry those things forward. So being kind of sympathetic to that system will endear you to me no end. So it's just useful to know what's going on, and we're always doing our best, but just there isn't a massive HR department there.
And James, presumably it's the same for most.
What do I think you need to do to prepare for your interview? So we've decided we want you. That's brilliant. You're coming along to an interview. Obviously, at the moment, we have this joy that some of the interviews are going to be in person. Wonderful, love an interview in person. Some of them are going on Zoom. Not so much fun. Quite a lot of challenges to do with Zoom interviews. So I'd say before any interview, carry on doing your research, understand more about the practice, the role. If you haven't already made contact and come into the practice, do so before your interview. And prepare for questions. So there are going to be standard questions. Some of the ones we're going to go through later with you are kind of standard-ish ones to look at, but also prepare some for yourself. There is nothing worse than getting to the end of an interview saying, have you got any questions for us? And a blank stare facing you. It just makes you think, okay, you clearly don't really want this job. Even if the questions are a bit kind of vague, that's absolutely fine. It just shows that you've engaged with this process. You do want this job. You want to find out a bit more. So just have some in the back of your mind. Have the core questions that you're always going to get asked. Explain your career. Why do you want to work for us? What are your strengths and weaknesses? They're pretty much always going to come up. So just have some answers in your mind ready. Don't have them verbatim. just have them kind of ready to talk through. Like I've said, make those connections, and when you are coming in for your interview, make the connection with whoever's checking you in. You want to leave an impression everywhere you go that's as good as possible. Be ready to sell yourself. Any job interview, that's effectively what you're doing. There's a few people who really like, talking about themselves and how wonderful they are, John. But most people don't particularly like the overselling of themselves. It feels quite uncomfortable, but that is what the interview is there to do. So you've told me what your kind of core qualifications are. I've read your CV, we've read the covering letter. Your interview is that opportunity to sell yourself as a person and why you are going to want to be the right fit for the team and the right person to join the organisation. So think about what are your qualities that are going to make us go, oh, brilliant, yes, that's really what we want as part of the team. If you are doing a Zoom interview, make sure your tech works. If you have very poor Wi-Fi, find an alternative to trying to connect to your neighbour's Wi-Fi using a dodgy password, because if it doesn't work, it just makes everything so much harder. We did a social prescribing interview about 6 weeks ago, and I ended up, she was meant to do this presentation, her internet went out, she then did it on her phone, I never saw her face, it was just a complete disaster of an interview. So if you are having to do it on Zoom, make sure that you've got the internet's going to work, you've got the tech set up, that actually your laptop is not here and that you're looking up. Make sure that actually I'm going to be able to see your face, that the lighting is right, that you know where it's going to do, that kids aren't going to run through, or a dog isn't going to bark in the middle of it, because it all kind of has a pretty big impact on it when you have this kind of little window into your life to look at. And the other thing I think is know what you want before you go in. So like I said, we've probably designed a job for specific reasons. If you are really not actually applying for that job, then maybe it's not the right one. If you are coming to that job, but there are some things that you would like to discuss, be clear about that. You don't need to be confrontational about it. That's another problem. Sometimes you get to an end of an interview and then people want to be slightly confrontational in kind of whether it's salary or days working and things like that. It's absolutely fine to discuss things. There's no need to be kind of confrontational, because otherwise that's the lasting impression. But knowing what you want out of the role and being able to clearly articulate that does help the whole process. So just being clear about why you want the job, and if there are other things that you might want to discuss, so that actually they can be brought into the process rather than feeling like an attack at the end. So we've talked about good impressions. I do think it is quite important in terms of kind of how you present yourself for a role. That is not to say that everybody has to turn up in a suit for an interview, but dress appropriately to the role you're applying for, and it's something that's going to make you feel confident. Blokes, I would probably not wear a light blue shirt for an interview. It doesn't tend to go very well for you, is my experience. So think about if you are going to be nervous, how that's that you're going to wear comfortable clothes, that you're going to feel confident in, and that again it's going to leave a kind of good impression for the interview. Similarly, if you're going to be on Zoom, dress as if you're coming to the practice. I realise that a lot of people have been stuck at home for a very long time, but actually kind of the Zoom interviews where people are kind of dressed as if they're kind of just got out of bed is not an overwhelmingly impressive way forward. And I have had to do one of those and it was very odd. So yeah, make sure you feel comfortable. Remember your body language. Again, particularly on Zoom, I think you can where your camera is, how you move. Don't ever do an interview on a wheelie chair, because you will invariably move side to side, and it is incredibly disconcerting to try and watch someone do an interview while they're swinging back and forward on a chair. We did it last week and it was happening, and it's really quite unnerving to kind of watch. So get yourself comfortable, make sure things are set up that you're going to be able to keep your body language in a kind of positive and engaged way. Zoom, even more difficult, you can't do eye contact. So just kind of something to think about. If you're on Zoom, tidy your background. Make sure it's both tidy and kind of sensible. If you can use it to sell your personality. So you play guitar, leave your guitar in the background of your Zoom. If there are things that you can sell about yourself through Zoom, that's absolutely fantastic. Make sure it's tidy and you're selling who you are. Don't leave it as a complete mess with everything that you ate last night in the background. I had a very weird experience with a webinar about 2 weeks ago where there was this guy giving a presentation on quite serious topics, and on the shelf behind him was a collection of DVDs which were based like Basic Instinct, Fatal Attraction, all these ones which was a bit like, okay, this is interesting. And then behind him he had these plastic, what looked like plastic like boxes stuck on the window of these French doors, which turned out they were like cat boxes for cats to sit in. But it was so distracting I had to Google it rather than listen to him, because I just wanted to know what the hell the things stuck to his window were. So, you know, if you are doing Zoom, it is really easy for people to get distracted. I'm sure some of you have already kind of checked your phone about 5 times while I've been talking. So, you know, if you're using Zoom, like John, I'm surprised he's even kind of in the room at the moment, to be honest. I have to keep kicking his cue up, but it is really important. If you're doing a Zoom, make sure that actually you are treating it as if you're coming into an interview, because otherwise that is the lasting impression that I'm going to have is of the background and what it says about you. I've already said, prepare those common questions. Don't kind of be completely flummoxed by what your strengths and weaknesses are. Just have some of those in your arsenal. Have some examples of good practice. If you have done a quality improvement project, rerun it in your mind so you know how you're going to explain it concisely if you're asked about it. And like I said, have some questions that you want to ask. There are bound to be things that you want to ask about the practice. Have them kind of mulling around in your head so that when we get to that point, you can actually ask them rather than it just end with you walking out the door having asked nothing and then sending emails or something afterwards. And it does work both ways. So actually, if the practice hasn't made any efforts and they've interviewed you in a dark cupboard, then maybe that is something to take away as well. You know, as the person doing the interviewing, I'm wanting to make it feel like this is somewhere that you would want to come and work. If actually that hasn't been the kind of experience and there isn't a reason for it, maybe that is something to kind of think about as well. It is a two-way process. So you should come away from an interview still wanting the job, which may not always be the case. So what's going to make you a good candidate? Right, use the skill you have got. You guys are all GPs, and actually, therefore, you have a kind of skill set which is very useful in this environment. Think of your interview like a consultation. So we're the ones who are the GPs as the interviewers. We're trying to work out if you're the right person for the job. Do you have the skills we're needing? So in the same way that in a consultation you're going to pay attention to the way that the patient walks into the room, because actually that's going to tell you whether the leg pain's real or not. You're going to pay attention to their body language, because actually that's going to tell you whether they're really depressed or not. It's the same thing in an interview. So use the skills that you have as GPs to counteract that. Know all the kind of the things that you would be looking out for if it was the other way around, and try and counteract any. So it is, you know, the first impression is important. Eye contact is always useful. If you are going to someone's asking you a question, look at the person asking the question, engage with the person who's asked you the question. Don't ignore the other people in the room, but it's going to tend to move around people asking the question, so answer it to the person that's asked you the question. It's nothing weirder than you ask a question and somebody else gets the answer. It just feels very uncomfortable to be part of that team. Listen to what's being said to you. Pay attention to everything that is being said, so that actually when you are speaking, you are answering the question that is asked of you. There is absolutely no problem with asking for a question to be repeated. If you need to write something down, if you want it to be clarified, just answer the actual question, because that is the weirdest thing about interviews, is when you ask questions and you don't get answers. You get a very long load of words, but you don't actually get an answer to the question. And the problem is, you're going to see later when we send around the scoring information, that I'm going to score you based on, have you actually answered the question that I have asked? So talking for 5 minutes doesn't necessarily mean I'm going to give you a point against that if actually you haven't answered the question, but you've told me a fascinating story about a time you were in Tenerife or whatever it was. So listen to the question and then answer the question and then move on to the next one. If there is things that you really feel that you need to add to the kind of information about you, there is going to be an opportunity to do that at the end. So try not to shoehorn in things that aren't relevant to the question, because it takes the flow out, and it's quite disconcerting as the person doing the interview. And I'm going to keep coming back to this, but make that impression at the whole way through, but also think about the end. One of the challenges, if you're doing a group of interviews, so say I'm doing 5 interviews, that is probably 5 hours of time at least. If you're the first person that I'm interviewing, you have a massive advantage. You set the standard for the day. And so I'm probably going to remember you clearly because you came in, I was fresh, I just drank my 17th cup of coffee that morning, I was ready. By the kind of 2, 3, and 4, you run the risk of blurring into each other unless you're making an impression on me. Now, the last person of the day has another advantage in that they're the last person to leave an impression. So it is worth kind of, you're not going to be able to find out where you are in that list of interviews, but just remember that you want to leave an impression. And if you are in the middle, then you're going to have to work a bit harder, because when I come to the end of the day and we're all going through our lists, we want things that are going to go, oh yes, I remember that was X who said Y. So just try and leave a positive impression in everything you're doing. So how you ask those questions at the end, how you leave, make a good impression the whole way through, make yourself memorable for the right reasons. And then so the last thing really is kind of bringing that all together. So how can we make it successful? So prepare and follow the process. Like I said, if a process is set for the way that recruitment is going to work, follow it, because that is going to indicate to the practice that actually you can follow an instruction, that actually you're going to be working as part of a team. You've got to work in the ways that are set out. So don't try and fight against the system. It's just an instant kind of red flag. Get your answers ready to things. If you can prepare anything, prepare it so that actually you're not blindsided. Don't equally make it all into a verbatim, kind of have it all written down, because that is not great either. But just kind of have your answers be ready. Make sure your non-verbal communication is something you're thinking about the whole time, because actually most communication is non-verbal. So you want to give the best impression to everyone you meet throughout it. Dress for the job. Please make sure your backgrounds are tidy and not distracting. I never want to see another cat box again, as fascinating as it was to find out about it. Listen to everything that is being said throughout the whole process and react to it. Talk enough, but don't talk too much. I think this is particularly, and then the next two, the kind of friendly and not being cocky. Particularly, I think when you're interviewing in the practice where you have trained or had lots of experience, that can kind of muddy the situation. And part of the whole kind of recruitment process is we've got to be fair and we've got to treat everyone the same. So even if you do know everybody, if you've been the kind of trainee in the practice for the last year, treat it as if it's an interview that you are going to a new practice. Obviously, you can use the advantage of knowing more about the practice in your interview, answer questions that show that actually you've taken on board things for the last year, but don't kind of turn it into something that actually is overly friendly and not still professional, that you're still not, you need to be showing that you're taking it seriously. Always use appropriate language, as much as slang and lols is funny. Just answer the questions in appropriate language, never swear, even if you do know them well. And like I say, answer the questions. I cannot tell you how frustrating it is to do endless interviews where you never get an answer to a question and you have to score people down. It's particularly when people are clearly capable and good, and you want to score them up. And actually, if you ask a question and they don't, you've got to treat everyone fairly. And that is the biggest problem I have seen, is that people just aren't listening to the question. They're answering the question that they want you to ask, not the one that's actually been asked of them. Remember to ask those questions. And just remember that no one likes interviews. I have done hundreds of them. and I still don't like it. It's not a very fun process for anyone. It's not fun for you as the person being interviewed. It's not great for the people doing the interviewing. You go into interviews knowing you're going to disappoint people. That is a horrible feeling, trust me. So, just try and be cool, be calm, be confident. If you're kind of taking it more in your stride, it makes it easier for the people doing the interview. They are going to relax a bit, and actually you're more likely to make that positive impression. That's it, I think. So hopefully that was useful.
Yeah, it's super useful. I'm really good to hear it from the perspective of someone who's not a GP, and so from someone who will actually be absolutely integral to the process, to hear it from the other side. So things like how, I don't think I ever really realised how much it actually costs, how long it takes to recruit people, all that kind of thing. I just think you don't know, you don't find that out as doctors, and I think it is important to consider the people on the other side of the interview table as well, and obviously making things as straightforward for them as possible puts you in the best possible place to get that job. So there's a few questions coming, James, that we could put to you. And I guess Ed and got Hannah here. We could all kind of chip in with these. So the first one is, what are competitions rates like for GP jobs in Exeter? So I might take this one actually. So it's very variable, is what I will say. It's been really variable over the last year or so because of COVID, and I think there has been lots of people who finished training and felt like being a locum was going to be the thing for them. Because of the uncertainty about COVID and because there were very few locum jobs around, I think certainly for a time it has been more competitive to get a job. I think Devon is a big area, so it's always been the case that there's been more competition in some places than others. Generally, the central Exeter ones are popular, and also the well-renowned or well-regarded teaching practices are always popular as well. If you apply to a failing practice or somewhere that's advertising for a lot of money, the conversation, there isn't going to be any competition. They will open their arms up to you and grab you and throw you into duty before you've had time to send in your CV. So it's very variable. We're trying here with this process or with this afternoon is we're trying to enable you. If you went for the most competitive job in Devon, we're trying to help you to stand the best possible chance of getting that job. So it is variable, but even if there's only you and another person, and you're pretty sure you're going to get the job, just do as good a job as possible, because those impressions count. And if in the future you want to increase your sessions or become a partner or anything like that, that impression you made out of that interview will kind of endure onwards. So, Ed, maybe you could answer this one. Do you think the interviews are going to go back to face-to-face?
There are some advantages to Zoom interviews because you can interview people from different areas of the country and so forth. But interestingly, if ever you ask an interview panel, what they most want is to have the person physically there. That is sort of like our ideal. So pretty much everybody would say if they have an ideal interview situation, it would be to physically have the person there, because you just feel like you get this extra information from the presence of somebody. And that's not to say that Zoom is a disaster, because there are some things that you actually pick up from Zoom that you may not pick up from a face-to-face interview. Like James was saying, you pick up an impression about what they're like with IT, because they have to actually navigate that in front of you, and you also get an impression of where they live sometimes, or the kind of things that they sort of leave in their background. So there's a degree of nosiness that I quite like in Zoom, peering into people's lives. But at the end of the day, I think most people, if they have the choice, they would go for face-to-face interview. They want to press the flesh. They want to smell you. They want to see you. They want to see the way you walk into a room and how you sort of handle yourself. I think that's me.
Yeah, I mean, I think with the kind of unlocking and everything, and all the COVID rules going out of the window, I think they're going to go back to face.
And even if they're not face to face yet, you'll have the opportunity to make an impression by going on a practice visit anyway. So even if you don't have the full interview face to face, going and meeting the practice manager and going for a look around and meeting people, you'll still have the opportunity.
James, one for you. How long is the average interview?
So I think on average it's probably about kind of half an hour to 45 minutes. I think there is something that you have really got the first 5 minutes to make that impression, and that's where actually making an impression beforehand is quite important. But generally, I would say once you got past 45 minutes, an interview is probably not going in the right direction.
Yeah, so I got told last week it would be an hour, and it was actually probably about 40 minutes, and it felt very much wrapped up in 40 minutes, and that felt like a lot of questions.
I think if you're going to do an interview that's got kind of multiple processes in presentations or group work or something like that, that might take longer. But I would say for the number of questions, I know what we're going to send out as a long list of questions, but we would normally do kind of 8 to 10 questions, I think, because actually if you go on for too long, what are you getting out of it?
Who would normally be on the interview panel? So for a GP job, it's likely to be some partners and some of the management team, I would say, would be pretty typical. It's very unlikely to be everybody.
How many people would you have in yours interviewing?
Four.
Yeah, so hopefully shouldn't be too much of a scary kind of situation. And I think if 4 people agree that a candidate is good, then that normally suffices. We can be wrong, but often we're right. Can we get a copy of the slides? Of course, absolutely, and we've recorded it as always, so there will be a recording available as well. Hannah, you might answer this one. Are most jobs advertised on the LMC? Is it worth contacting practices directly?
Yes, would be my answer to that. So yeah, I think most jobs are advertised on the LMC, but there's often stuff going on in the background that hasn't made it to advert yet, where it might be worth contacting practice directly. So from my recent experiences, I emailed a few practices that I thought might be a good fit for me that weren't advertising yet, and said, here are the reasons why I think it would be good for me to work where you are. I would be like to be kept in mind if there's any jobs coming up. And off the back of that, I had 2 maternity locum offers which weren't advertised yet. So I wouldn't necessarily have applied for those, and I didn't end up taking them. But actually, if that was the right practice for me, then I would have had an in there without it ever making it to advert. So I think that it definitely is worth contacting practices directly, and it also just shows that you are a proactive person, and people would think, oh, there's a reason that they're contacting us. I think it would make a good impression on a practice. So so if there are, particularly if geographically, if there are places that you think, well, that would be great for me, or you've heard about a practice that you think would really suit you, then it's definitely worth going direct.
I mean, we've had situations where a really good candidate has been in touch, showed an interest, and we've made a job for them. We know from experience that you can almost never have too many good people in your team, and so I think it is worth contacting people, being proactive, because you'll stick in their minds, and they may be thinking about advertising. It's a long process. They may think in the next 6 months we might need someone, and if you're a person that seems to fit, they might be able to bring that forward for you. So always worth contacting them. Write a nice email about how great the practice is and say, have you got any jobs coming up? And you might be in luck.
Sorry, just to interrupt, would you send your cover letter with that, or just an email and CV?
For those ones, I just sent an email, but the kind of email was sort of structured like, I guess, a bit like a cover letter. So I guess it's not quite as formal as here is my application, I am applying for this specific job, but it was more a case of sort of introducing myself and having some of the same stuff that was on a cover letter, but then attaching my CV as well.
And there are all sorts of other things. So there are, sometimes we might not have a salaried post, but we might have a sabbatical cover or maternity cover or someone might be dropping a few sessions, so we might be able to offer you a day or 2 days a week to go and get your foot in the door, and then kind of build it from there. So it's definitely worth contacting practices if there's one that particularly interests you. James, this one's to you. As a practice manager, what do you think of portfolio GPs at interview? So if they've got other interests, I guess.
I think it's generally really positive, because I don't think that actually full-time GP is a kind of particularly sustainable job as it was, and I think people having portfolio roles is really important. I think what I would say is it comes down to, if the job we've advertised for is 6 sessions, coming and telling for it and saying you only want 2, that's problematic. Like I said, if there's a job we've advertised, there's probably a reason why we've advertised it. It's not to say there isn't a level of flexibility, but job shares are quite hard. So it might be worth kind of approaching and having a conversation before putting in an application, to understand kind of what is the role, is there flexibility around it, rather than kind of going down a process and then going, actually I only want to work 1 day a week. But I think the portfolio kind of way of working is the future, in the way that I think most people should be kind of going, because actually it gives you more variability, and people will tend to work harder if they've got kind of breaks away from the coalface.
I think just building on that, and also something you said in your talk, James, I think being upfront about that right at the beginning is the important thing. So from my recent experience, the job that was advertised was far more sessions than I wanted or could commit to, but I wanted to potentially work at that practice. So I straight away, when I had a conversation with the practice manager, said, look, this is what I'm looking for, these are the days that I want. I understand if that doesn't fit with what you want, but I was just straight away up front. And then they came back and said, actually, for the right candidate, we'll change the job around, or we'll, increase the sessions and spread them between 2 people and that sort of thing. So, but I think if I'd gone through the process and then said that at the end, that would not have been very well received.
Yeah, it's that. If that's the last impression you leave, is we've done all of this and now you've thrown a roadblock in the way of things.
Yeah,
that's not.
But if someone comes to you up front and says, I'm doing all these other things, but actually I really want to come to you 2 days a week or whatever, could you consider me? Then that's not a closed door.
Because then you can change the recruitment process around that.
You're looking for 2 people, or exactly. Yeah. How long before qualifying should we apply for jobs?
So it doesn't really matter. I mean, again, it depends where you're applying to. So if you're applying to someone who's in desperate need of someone starting as quickly as possible, then obviously they'll be looking for people who are finishing training pretty soon. I would say practices expect about a 3-4 month kind of lag time before people can start. The fact that they if you're working in other practices, they'll need to give notice. So I would say we would advertise probably 3 months before we would expect someone to actually start working with us. Having said that, I would, if there's a job that you like the look of, and it's 6 months or between less than a year before you qualify, approach the practice, because they may not be in desperate need of someone right then and there, and if you're the right person, they'll wait. Or they may have other things coming up in the future. And actually, James has said of what a laborious process this whole recruiting thing is. So we've actually had people who we've ended up we advertised for 1 job, and we've actually taken on 2 people, but one didn't finish their training for about 9 or 10 months afterwards. So it's always worth having that discussion, putting your name in, even if it's seemingly a really long time until you finish. I don't think that would be a problem at all.
I know quite a lot of people that applied for jobs like way before, and and got on with the practice and was well received, and they said, yeah, we'll fill with locums in the meantime or whatever, because it was the right person for the right job. So I think if you think it's a good idea, then don't hold off doing it, because particularly in smaller practices, you don't know when there might be opportunities there again. And in bigger practices, they're keen to get the right people through the door and be a bit flexible probably about it, and are more able to. So
how much can you sort of talk about the salary? Like, is it when they advertise a fixed salary, is it like that's it, final, or can you sort of barter a little bit?
I think it's, again, variable on where you're applying and the other salary doctors there. If you're doing a role that nobody else does, then I think you can negotiate. But you have to bear in mind, you could go into, say there's a practice, it's got 2 salaried doctors, they've been there for 10 years, they will have been put on a salary 10 years ago. And if you suddenly go in saying you want more and more and more, that could destabilize all of the salaries in that practice. So it's really just just be a little bit careful about that. I think it's okay to talk about it, but kind of probably being upfront with the practice manager and maybe the partners is the way to go about it, because it can be very destabilizing. We have, how many salaried doctors do we have, James? 16 salaried doctors. And so if one person comes in and says, you're not paying the going rate, everybody needs a £500 per session pay rise, that's suddenly costing us quite a lot of money. So it's fine to negotiate salaries, but just be aware that there are some constraints that we are working with, and it's hard to give more money to one person than another person who's doing the same job.
And for locums, is it then more negotiable?
Yeah. Locum is totally negotiable. You don't want to price yourself out of the market, but there will be an acceptable range. And I think if you go wackily above that, or probably if you're too cheap as well, don't undersell yourself, that will flag up. So,
and say if you're locuming, someone was telling me that sometimes people start at like a like a reasonable sort of salary, and then work up later when they've been more established in the team. Is that a thing or not?
In terms of if you're a salary doctor?
No, in terms of a locum, like you'll start on something like, I don't know, a lower amount per session, and then maybe if they need you more or they trust you more, then you can go up a little bit. Is that a thing or not?
Don't know. Might be in some practices. I'm sure it is. I think as a locum, you have got more negotiating power, really, because you're not doing the job that everybody else is doing. And if it's particularly short notice, you've got a bit of wiggle room, and if the practice are really, really in need of you, you've got a bit of wiggle room. So I think as a locum, it's a bit more negotiable, as long as you don't price yourself out the market and go in with some crazy numbers. But I think as a salary doctor, everybody's working within constraints of what the business can afford, and what the other doctors who are currently working there are being paid.
And I guess your locum pay has to reflect your terms and conditions as well. So if you're going in with really strict terms and conditions saying I'm not going to do visits, or I'm only doing this many calls, or I'm doing whatever, and I want to be paid at the top end, that might not be viewed as well as if you're sort of more open about what you're going to be doing and your responsibilities and things. So it's probably just kind of working out what the important things to you are, and doing some negotiating, but not necessarily being super tough negotiator right at the beginning, sort of proving yourself.
Yeah. Of course, thanks.
I think the other thing with locum pay is that if you are working in the same building as salaried doctors, and it's likely as a locum you're doing less work than them, and so be mindful of that. Don't tell all the locum doctors, or don't tell all the salaried doctors how much you're earning per session, because it might feel quite galling to them, because their take-home pay includes holidays, pensions, all that kind of stuff, which as a locum you won't. Actually, it could kind of upset the balance in the team quite easily if they felt that they were being unpaid compared to you.
That sounds logical.
Any other questions?
Can I ask a question? I don't know if you. My internet's a bit dodgy though, so it seems to. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Yeah. So it's actually a friend had this situation last week. This is out of area, but so she'd been offered a job in a practice and she had accepted it, but they hadn't spoken about, or she hadn't asked, but hadn't been mentioned anything about maternity, kind of their maternity policy or how long you to work there and things like that before you go off, which is kind of on her radar. Is that kind of something that you get asked in an interview, or are people? I guess it affects women really, doesn't it? But are women usually quite upfront about asking that kind of thing, or is it a little bit of an awkward one? Or
I'll hand you over to James for this one.
I think this is where we're having a conversation beforehand, because again, it's kind of actually that information is going to be available whatever the policy is in place. So that's one of the reasons for making contact and having a conversation, so you actually can understand those things. Because it's very odd when you can kind of go into interviews and then asking questions about as part of the aim, then it becomes slightly confrontational. Whereas actually it isn't confrontational, it's the reasonable kind of information to ask for. Sorry, hopefully that be a bit better. So yeah, I would say that's the sort of thing to just hear about when you're actually applying for the job. Ask those questions rather than kind of doing it in actually.
So rather than comes across, I guess, quite personal, doesn't it? If you're asking in an interview sense, right? If you're just asking before you've applied for a job, then
I mean, it's going to be a standard. What the job offer is going to be is pretty standard in terms of what maternity is going to be, paternity, and all those sorts of things. So actually, ask the questions, make the contact, and then you're informed. And then it's again the fit is going to be right. So I would have those conversations first.
Yeah, and I think to reassure you about this, because I know this was a bit of a contentious issue, but now practices do get a decent level of funding for salaried doctors who are on maternity leave. So, it used to be a little bit of a thorny issue in terms of, some small partnerships, if they employed a salaried doctor who straight away went off, after being in post for just long enough to qualify for maternity pay, going off, that could destabilize the practice a little bit financially. Thankfully, that has pretty much gone now because the practice gets good levels of reimbursement for maternity pay. And so I think for most practices, they would be really kind of pleased that you were sort of open and honest about that, and it wouldn't kind of, I don't think, affect your chances of employment, because a lot of practices are looking for people who are going to be keepers, who are going to be good doctors that will stay for a while. And if you've been sort of open and honest about that, I don't think that would negatively affect you at all. We're not allowed to ask about it in interview. That would be deemed to be very, very naughty. So we'll never ask about it, but there will often be an assumption that, people will need maternity leave, at some point in the employment. So yeah, it's a good question, because, it's obviously, something on people's minds. And most contracts now definitely have that, they're pretty standardized now. I think most practices have moved over to a standard thing because the reimbursement is good. So it will just be, you get maternity pay. I think, James, you'll be able to clarify this a bit more for me. There's the slight issue about whether you have to have worked in the practice for a certain period of time before getting maternity pay. And that does still apply, but a lot of practices have waived that, because if they give you the maternity pay full, they can get the reimbursement, kind of.
I think it will depend a little bit on their workforce and because I think our philosophy has always been that if you want people to stay with your practice for the long term, you should treat them well the whole way along, and making sure that people are looked after when they're on maternity leave. They're much more likely to come back, and that's what all practices want. There is a time when people may go off on paternity leave, but if we're thinking about the next kind of 10 to 15 years, I think if you are good employers, then you get employees who are loyal and who will pay you back many times over in the future. So I think a lot of practices are quite flexible on that. I think it is worth checking in your contract about some will, and some of this might just be outdated actually, but a lot of practices may not have kind of reviewed this unless a situation has come up. So it is worth checking what the wording is around maternity pay in particular. So whether kind of continuous NHS service counts towards the amount of time you need to be working before you get maternity pay. Because bear in mind, GP practices are independent businesses. They're providing NHS services, but they're not actually exactly part of the NHS, as you might imagine. So that's open to interpretation by the practice. And obviously, some places might say you qualify for maternity pay immediately. Some might say 6 months. Some might say a year.
Yeah, I guess it also comes down to the general rule of getting your contract checked and, looking at that in detail. And if you're a BMA member, you can just send it off to the BMA for them to look through it. And there's a BMA model contract for salaried doctors in GP, which not every GP practice will have, like you say, no one will have necessarily looked at and changed what they have. If they adhere to the model contract, it should count as continuous service from training into a salaried role, as long as you don't have a period of more than 3 months not in a salaried role from the end of training to the beginning of your next job. So you should qualify for it if the contract fits with the BMA model contract, as long as you don't have more than 3 months gap.
And if you're locum, you don't get maternity pay, I'm afraid.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So that's quite a good question to ask, actually, isn't it? You can say to a practice, is your GP salaried contract the model BMA contract? If it's not, how does it differ? And then that will give you the kind of the clear differences.
I think the other thing, just from an employer's point of view, is that honesty. And if a newly qualified doctor comes to us and says, I want to work 10 sessions, by the way, what's your maternity policy? We want to be as accommodating as possible. We want to be as fair as possible, but we can probably see what's happening there. And so I think just honesty and building that relationship for the longer term is really important on both sides.
Can I ask a question which is not about maternity leave, but about sort of adapted sort of stuff? I know we had like a practice manager talk to us before about about childcare at more friendly hours and things. I'm not qualifying for a year, but I'm thinking, I'm in quite a tricky situation childcare wise, where I'm really going to struggle to do anything out of school hours. It's going to be a real struggle. And I know that, if you look generically at the sort of job vacancies, they don't sort of say, we offer school hours or whatever.
Yeah.
What would be the best way to go about that? Would it be to sort of basically write to people and say, by the way, this is my situation. What sort of things have you got available? Because my husband does shift work, and you can say, well, you could locum around your husband's shift work, but I really want a stable salary post. I just want it to be able to be done.
Yeah, I can give you 2 examples, Catherine, of 2 different practices and how they've worked that sort of thing out. So I know of one practice within our patch who has people on almost like different banding, so salaried doctors who do different banding, which either means different hours, different responsibilities, not doing duty days, doing different levels of admin and things like that, and having their hours sort of like fixed within that. So it's not like one size fits all for all the salaried jobs. Another one that essentially does an annualized contract. So you'd be contracted for example, 20 hours a week. Some weeks you won't be able to do 20 hours. Other weeks you might do 30 hours, depending on shift work and, other things that you're working around. And I think, and that particularly the one I'm thinking of is a bigger practice who are able to kind of flex with that a bit. So it's more about the fact they need that amount of GP cover, but actually it's not necessarily like we need you to have a list and be Mondays and Tuesdays and Wednesdays every week or whatever. So there are practices that are already doing things in a different way. Obviously there's the retainer scheme is there. I think fewer practices are doing the retainer scheme at the moment, I know people that have struggled to find practices to take on retainers in the last couple of years.
We'll have fun.
They'll have them. But, you know, I know that that's been more challenging in the last few years. I think part of that is as things like the New to Practice Fellowship have come about, there are kind of other offerings, and the retainer scheme maybe hasn't been quite as popular. But that's obviously there as an option. But I think just contacting practices that you think might work for you and just being quite upfront about it. I was really surprised when this one particular practice said to me, oh, we could do, you know, an annualized hours thing, and you could do this, you could do this. I thought, oh my God, didn't even know that that would be an option. So just be open about it. And if you like them and they like you, I think a lot of practices will be flexible. And if they're not, then it's not the right place for you.
Yeah, exactly. I think you know, because there has been a shortage of GPs in some places, I think people have had to be more creative and have gone away from the you need to be in the practice 8:30 to 6:30, because all practices, if they're struggling for numbers, would rather have someone for one session in the middle of the day than have no one. You know, it's common sense, isn't it? And I think there is certainly negotiating to be done, and I think that common theme of making contact with places in advance, starting conversations early is really kind of pertinent to this as well.
Yeah, and that's true. I think to echo John's comments, it might be, you know, practices that, you know, have had no trouble recruiting in the traditional sense may not have flexed in that way yet, whilst other practices may have kind of done that to get ahead of the curve if they were concerned about recruitment. So yeah, I think there are various offerings out there, and you know, like Hannah said, it's kind of exploring, looking at the practices that you think might fit for you and contacting them. It's probably a good thing to do ahead of time, really.
Yeah, I mean, have a look into I would encourage anybody in that kind of situation to have a look at the retainer scheme. It's a bit of a win-win, really, in terms of for the employer, half your salary is paid by NHS England, I think, and you are allowed to be more flexible with that contract. So that would be something to look at. You know, I think I think the drawbacks are you're not allowed to have a list, and it's up to 4 sessions, maybe. Is that right, Ed?
Yeah,
I think it's
and I think practices are only really supposed to have one retained doctor. But I would have thought practices, if they knew there's someone out there looking to be part of the retainer scheme, would be fairly keen.
Yeah, it's 4 sessions, but that's 4 clinical GP sessions within a week. So you can do other sessions. So, for example, if you were a coil fitter, you could do a session of coil fitting somewhere else, even if not as a GP, normal clinical session, and you could do out of hours, and you can do non-clinical things. So although it's 4 sessions, it's not completely restricted in that.